This is Bone Chillers to disturb your dreams. Dare to join us? Click subscribe, ring the bell. But remember, we cannot guarantee your safety from the nightmares that await. Prepare to be thrilled, chilled, and filled with a sense of dread you'll find nowhere else. Welcome to the darkness. We've been waiting.
The Ironbark Rebellion. The ironbark trees knew first, sensing the cries of the oppressed beneath their roots. Their gnarled branches trembled as the ground absorbed the suffering of those deemed unworthy. Elira had long since learned to listen to them. Tonight their creak sounded almost mournful. Ironbark Forest bordered the walls of Valoran's most fortified prison. Inside, the talented were caged like animals, healers, conjurers, elementalists, all who had been born with the rare gift of magic. Valoran's High Council, fearful of the abilities they could not control, hunted them like vermin, shoving them into iron cells dampened with glyphs to suppress their powers. Those who survived the capture were soon sent to laboratories where progress was pursued at any cost. Elira crouched by the edge of the forest, her fingers digging into the cool earth. She felt the pulse of magic running beneath her, a steady rhythm that grew whenever she focused on it. Tonight, that rhythm quickened as her allies, fellow exiles and magic-wielders assembled around her. "Are you sure about this, Elira?" whispered Tamsin, a conjurer whose hands trembled as she held a blade forged from her own blood, a dark art they'd all learned in desperation. Elira met her gaze, her dark eyes burning with resolve. "They took enough from us. We're not waiting any longer." As the moon climbed high, casting a silver sheen over the prison walls, Elira signaled to her companions. With practiced silence, they moved through the trees, their footsteps muted by enchantments, every member of her ragtag army bound by a shared hunger for justice and revenge. Inside the prison, a storm was brewing. Elira could feel the crackle of suppressed energy, her own magic straining against the restraint she held over it. She'd once been a healer, known for her gentle touch and compassion, but the Council's raids had stripped her of innocence, stolen her family, and bound her heart with an iron resolve. "Tonight," she reminded herself, "we give them a taste of their own cruelty." The guards patrolling the prison gates were the first to fall, their heavy armor rendered useless against the abilities of Elira's allies. Kyle, a fierce elemental capable of summoning fire, flicked his fingers and sent a ripple of heat toward them, igniting the guards' armor until they screamed and fell to the ground. Their deaths were swift, but brutal, a stark reversal of the horrors their hands had wrought. Tamsin and two others, earth-callers from the mountain tribes, pressed their palms to the ground, murmuring in unison. The iron gates groaned as if in pain, bending outward, twisted by unseen hands, until they snapped from their hinges and fell with a resounding crash. The path to the prison's interior lay open. The prisoners inside, weakened by days, months, or even years of torment, had hardly the strength to rise from their cells as Elira's group surged in. Some prisoners stared in confusion, others in fear, still others in a dim flicker of hope. "We're here for you!" Elira shouted, her voice carrying a commanding power that cut through the din. "Valoran's reign over you ends tonight!" In response, a distant clanging of metal against stone echoed through the corridors. Guards, alerted by the breach, rushed in, their weapons drawn. Elira raised a hand, focusing her magic with precision, a gift sharpened to a deadly point. A burst of energy rippled from her fingertips, shattering the incoming guards' weapons as if they were made of glass. A group of council mages emerged next, their robes embroidered with sigils of protection and subjugation. They glared at Elira, hatred and fear mixing in their gazes. "You will not leave here alive," hissed one of them, an elder woman with a face twisted by scars and cruelty. She raised her hands, channeling an incantation that darkened the air around her. Elira felt the spell before she saw it, a wave of sickly, putrid energy barreling toward her. She countered instinctively, extending her palms to meet the spell. Her magic collided with the Elder's attack, filling the corridor with a blast of light that momentarily blinded everyone around them. When the light faded, the elder lay collapsed on the ground, blood seeping from her nose. Elira, shaken but standing, moved forward, her path clear. Behind her, the prisoners and her allies pushed onward, overtaking their oppressors cell by cell. The laboratory wing was their final destination, a place of cold, metallic walls where horrors unimaginable had been visited upon her kind. The halls smelled of antiseptics, but no amount of sterility could mask the scent of fear that lingered in the air. Elira led her group forward, each step heavier than the last, as memories of friends lost to these sterile rooms surfaced. The head researcher, a slender man with a clinical gaze, stood waiting, flanked by a dozen council enforcers. He didn't flinch as Elira approached, his face eerily calm. "I don't suppose we can discuss this rationally," he sneered, glancing at the bruised, bleeding escapees crowding the corridor. "Rationality ended the day you began butchering us in the name of your research," Elira spat, her fists clenching. Her voice trembled with rage. "You stole my sister, my father. How many lives have you destroyed just because you feared us?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of humanity. "Fear? No, my dear. Control. Your power is a threat to order, to peace. Sacrifices must be made." With that, he raised a small rune-inscribed object, a failsafe, the Council's last weapon. He pressed his thumb to the rune, activating it. The walls trembled, and Elira felt her magic begin to drain, as if her very life were being siphoned away. But they had prepared for this. Tamsin took a step forward, her blade in hand, cutting her palm with grim determination. She knelt, pressing her bloody hand against the floor. Her blood seeped into the stone, spreading in intricate patterns that activated a counterspell they'd crafted in secret, a spell that would disrupt the prison's magic-nullifying wards. Elira felt the return of her strength like a flood, her power roaring back to life. She met the head researcher's eyes and saw, for the first time, a flicker of fear. "Sacrifices must be made," she echoed coldly, before releasing a torrent of energy that struck him down. The council enforcers moved to retaliate, but her allies were quicker. Flames, blades, and waves of raw power collided with the guards, who fell one by one under the assault of the prisoners they had once held captive. As the final guard fell, Elira stood in the midst of the chaos, her heart pounding. Around her, the liberated prisoners clung to each other, their expressions a mix of disbelief and relief. For the first time, the halls of Valoran's prison echoed with the cries of victory, not pain. Elira looked toward the ironbark forest visible through the shattered windows. She could feel the trees watching, ancient sentinels that had witnessed both suffering and, now, retribution. The forest would carry the story of this night to the farthest corners of the land, a tale of resilience, of fire, of justice won. But Elira knew their journey was far from over. The council would hunt them down, brand them traitors, terrorists. She would need to rally her allies, spread their defiance like wildfire, ensuring no more were torn from their families, no more were silenced. Tonight they had won a battle, but the war for their freedom had only just begun.
Real to ruin. The film was said to be cursed. Or at least that was the local lore, the kind of ghost story passed between film students in coffee-stained editing labs, its details hazy, fragmented, flickering like a forgotten reel left to decay. But in the early 70s, during Mexico City's golden age of horror cinema, the film had been the most ambitious project undertaken by the reclusive director Emilio Ruiz. And La Noche Eterna had nearly finished production until the entire cast and crew vanished. Rumours had been quick to surface, of course. Some claimed Ruiz had gone insane, sacrificing his actors in an occult ritual to bind the spirit of the film to its reels. Others whispered that the film itself was to blame, that it had been altered by some malevolent force intent on using it as a vessel for its dark will. But Ruiz was never found, and La Noche Eterna was quietly buried by the studio. Until, that is, the reels resurfaced 50 years later, discovered by Sofia Mendez, a down-on-her-luck film archivist who couldn't resist an urban legend, especially one that dangled just enough mystery to entice. Her life had stagnated, bogged down by a career that had gone nowhere. Her dream of becoming a director was lost to endless reels of other people's work. And so, when she found the dusty metal canister, hidden behind a stack of neglected films in the back of a warehouse, she couldn't resist. She popped the lid off with a decisive click and was greeted by the sharp, sour scent of old celluloid. The reels inside were brittle, fragile to the touch, but mostly intact. On the outermost reel, the words La Noche Eterna had been scrawled in white marker. That night she sat in her dimly lit apartment, the reels threaded carefully onto her projector, heart thrumming with a strange mix of excitement and dread. A dark impulse gnawed at her, whispered that this was forbidden, dangerous. But the need to know, to see what no one else had seen, proved stronger. The film began with a flicker, colours dulled by time, the images blurring in and out of focus. But the artistry was undeniable. Ruiz's signature long takes, his unsettling angles, his penchant for grainy black and white close-ups of hollow-eyed actors. The story seemed to bleed anguish and terror. It was hypnotic. Halfway through, the screen went black and a low hum filled the room, rattling the projector. Sophia leaned in, straining to hear something just below the hum, something like whispers scraping along the edges of her consciousness. She felt a prickle at the back of her neck and looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see Ruiz himself standing there, tall and skeletal, his face twisted into an unholy grin. Nothing. And yet the unease didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger, settling into her like a toxin. Sophia slept fitfully that night, her dreams haunted by shifting shadows, faces twisted into silent screams, a world drenched in greys and inky blacks. The next day she returned to the archives, unable to shake the feeling that the film had left something behind in her apartment. Every mirror in her small, cramped space had seemed to warp and shift, every reflection holding something just wrong. At work, Sophia tried to track down more information about La Noche Eterna, but the records were fragmentary at best, erased at worst. It was as if every person connected to the film had been wiped from history, leaving only scattered pieces, glimpses into the tragedy. A production still of an empty set, an actor's name scrawled hastily in a ledger. No one seemed to have cared enough to preserve Ruiz's magnum opus, or maybe they'd all been too afraid. When Sophia watched the film again that night, she noticed details she'd missed before. Shapes lurking in the background of certain shots, eyes gleaming from darkened corners, faces so blurred they seemed to shift, to move when she looked away. At first, she chalked it up to the degraded quality of the film. But as she watched further, she realized the faces were becoming clearer, emerging from the shadows, as if the film itself was coming alive, responding to her attention. A chill prickled up her spine. She paused the projector, leaned in close to the flickering frame, squinting at the hazy shapes at the edge of the shot. Just as she thought she was close to discerning one of the figures, her lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. She stumbled, heart racing, scrambling for her phone's flashlight. When she finally illuminated the space, she found herself alone, but her reflection in the darkened TV screen seemed to stare back at her, eyes wide and haunted as though she were part of the film. Days passed and Sophia couldn't bring herself to stop. Each time she played the reels, more of the film became visible, revealing pieces of footage that hadn't been there before. An actor standing stock still, staring directly into the lens with dead eyes. The barest suggestion of Ruiz's outline, fingers lifted as though conducting something unseen. Her apartment became a shrine to the film. Storyboards, production notes, and stills from the movie lined her walls, forming a mosaic of obsession. She began spending hours each night, piecing together the fragments, trying to reconstruct the missing pieces. Every cut, every transition, it all became part of her own pulse, as if the film had grafted itself onto her soul. Then the visions began. She'd catch glimpses of him, Ruiz watching her from the corners of her apartment, lurking just out of reach, his lips curling into a smile that was far too wide. At first, She tried to dismiss it as stress, lack of sleep, but it was real. Every night, Ruiz was there, grinning, always closer, always watching. Finally, on the 7th night, Sofia threaded the reels one last time, driven by a compulsion she could no longer resist. As the film rolled, her apartment filled with a low, rhythmic hum, like a heartbeat. Her reflection appeared in the projector's beam, her face twisted, unrecognizable. And then she saw herself on the screen. Her own eyes stared back at her, wide and filled with terror, her mouth open in a scream she couldn't hear. Behind her, Ruiz stood, his long skeletal fingers digging into her shoulders, holding her in place, keeping her still as the image began to dissolve, her face stretching, distorting, merging with the film itself. The room went dark. The projector flickered, then clicked off. The reels spun to a halt, and the silence settled over her like a shroud. In the days that followed, Sofia's absence went unnoticed by her colleagues. Eventually, the landlady entered her apartment, her nose wrinkling at the sour smell of old film stock and stale air. She found nothing but an empty projector, the reels of La Noche Eterna scattered around, remnants of a life that had vanished into the celluloid. But if anyone had bothered to watch those reels, to squint at the blurry shapes and distorted faces, they might have noticed one that looked oddly familiar, a woman with wide, terrified eyes, trapped forever in the reels, her scream silently echoing into eternity.
The edge where time breaks. Time fractures in shards beneath his feet, glinting dangerously as Ethan stumbles forward. He's always believed in a straight line, a single forward march to vengeance. Now, in this pale corridor, no, in every corridor he's ever been down, there's nothing straight about it. He's back here again somehow. The walls peel at the edges, cold iron breathing in strange fits, the dim blue light trembling as if in fear. He keeps his rifle close, wary, every sense on edge. But he knows with a gnawing certainty that no bullet can touch what he's about to face. They'd trained him as one of the Rageborn, Earth's last hope against the forces that destroyed his home. The training was brutal. He remembered every bruise, every broken bone, every mission run through synthetic simulations, every lecture on the raw, burning purpose of rage. They needed that rage. The commanders knew that hate was their only fuel, the only thing keeping Earth's last defenders sharp. "Time is our weapon," Commander Rain had said on his first day. Time, and the will to wield it. We'll pull their victories out from under them, strike before they've even learned our names. Ethan had felt it then, a glimmer of pride, a sense of worth. He would learn the timelines, walk through their corridors like an assassin through a sleeping fortress. Yet he'd never thought time itself would fight back. The mission was meant to be simple. Earth's orbit 22 years ago, back when humanity still had cities, still knew peace. The alien fleet had drawn close, hungering for a fresh conquest. Ethan's job was to sabotage their initial ship, a small ripple that would disrupt their entire invasion. It should have been easy. Instead, he was back here. He looks around, and his heart sinks. It's the same corridor, but there's something wrong. A strange rust spreading over the walls, creeping in the edges of his vision. A whispering decay that gnaws at his bones. He can feel it in his mind, clawing at the edges. He'd only gone a few years back. How could a corridor look so old? He turns, expecting to see the sleek, sterile walls of the alien vessel, the clean-lined precision of the enemy. Instead, the walls are lined with jagged metal, rusted and warped as though 100 years had passed since he first stepped through the door. He feels a tug, as if something is pulling at his heart, twisting it toward a memory he doesn't yet have, an emptiness he can't place. "No," he whispers, barely audible. "No." The commanders didn't talk much about the risks of traveling alone. Every soldier knew of a friend who'd gone in and didn't come back, but there was always some quiet assurance that they'd simply failed or died quick deaths in the line of duty. What none of them discussed, what no one wanted to acknowledge, were the rumors. Soldiers who'd returned only to vanish again, as if their entire existence had slipped out of reality. He forces himself to move forward, each step feeling heavier. At first, he thinks it's the weight of his armor, but then he realizes it's his own body that feels strange, as if he's older than he was a moment ago. His legs ache. A dull burn radiates through his chest. He glances down at his hands, but the gloves block his view. The air is thicker now, harder to breathe. He presses on, pushing past the jagged, corroded door that wasn't there before. On the other side, he expects to see the bright, clinical glow of the alien ship. Instead, he's met with a void, a dark, swirling space that looks less like a place and more like the absence of one. And in the middle of it stands himself. The other him, identical but wrong somehow, stares back, wearing the same armor, the same tired eyes, yet older. Much older. Scars run down his face, twisting his mouth into a grimace. His eyes are dark pits, heavy with loss, as if he's seen more than a lifetime's worth of horrors. And when he speaks, his voice is like gravel, rough and hollow. "You can't go back, Ethan," he says, his voice vibrating through the dark. Ethan raises his weapon instinctively, leveling it at the figure. "What are you?" The older Ethan chuckles bitterly. "I'm what you'll be, what you've already been. It doesn't matter how many times you try to go back. The path ends here." "No," Ethan spits, his hands tightening on the weapon. "I'm here to finish my mission. To save Earth." Save Earth? The words sound so empty in the other's mouth, like a recitation of a half-remembered dream. "There's nothing left to save. Look around you." He gestures, and suddenly Ethan can see the wreckage, broken fragments of Earth floating in the void like discarded toys. The charred remains of continents drift by, lifeless, orbiting a broken moon. He shakes his head, disbelief filling his chest. This isn't real. This is a trick, a test. The other Ethan steps forward, his voice softening. "I thought the same. Every time I thought it was just some cruel hallucination, some trick the enemy pulled, but it's real. We've been sent back again and again, trying to change a future that's already dead." "No!" Ethan yells, rage boiling in his veins. "If I can go back, if I can try just one more time—" "It's the time itself that's eating us alive, don't you get it?" The other Ethan growls, his voice breaking. "Every mission drains a piece of us. Every failed attempt leaves us here, in this nothingness, until there's nothing left to go back to. We're the fragments, the echoes, the pieces of every soldier who tried to save a world that's already gone." Ethan feels his grip slacken. His arms are shaking, his vision blurring as he looks down, seeing the faintest trace of wrinkles on his hands, lines that weren't there moments ago. His skin feels stretched, thin, as if he's aging in seconds. "No," he breathes, barely a whisper. The older Ethan places a hand on his shoulder, a gesture both familiar and alien. "The longer you stay, the faster it happens. Time devours us here. Every failed mission, every attempt, it only brings us closer to this void. You can try again, but you'll end up back here, older, weaker, just another scrap in the dark." Ethan looks back, staring at the path he took, the hallway that's now twisted with decay, its steel walls bleeding rust and grime. He knows in the pit of his stomach that there's no way back. The future is ashes, the past a dead end. And he, like all the others before him, is caught in this relentless loop of time, each failure drawing him closer to the edge where everything crumbles. In the distance, he hears footsteps. Other versions of himself, young, hopeful, desperate, marching toward the same futile end. And he knows, with a bone-deep certainty, that he's only one among thousands, trapped on the jagged edge where time breaks and devours. There's nothing to do but wait as the void closes in, pulling him into its endless, hungry maw.
The Forgotten Pig.
When the mountain appeared overnight in the heart of the Pacific, its form split the ocean horizon, jagged and bleak, like an obsidian tooth piercing the sky. No satellite had captured it before, no mapmaker had ever recorded its existence, and yet there it was, immense and ancient, as if the Earth itself had kept it hidden until now. Its dark, twisted spires called out to those who first saw it, igniting a fevered curiosity among scientists and explorers alike. And so the expedition to the Forgotten Peak was set. Dr. Emma Holbrook, a seasoned geologist, joined the first team of researchers dispatched to survey the mountain. Their ship, the Sea Voyager, carved through turbulent waters until it reached the base of the mountain, where the waves grew strangely calm. The peak's surface was blackened and glossy, as if polished by unseen hands. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was watching them, waiting for something or someone. As they anchored by a stretch of uneven shore, Emma's excitement warred with a gnawing unease. The mountain exuded an unnatural cold, chilling her to the core, despite the tropical waters surrounding it. She took a deep breath, gripping her equipment as they made their way up the first steep incline, their boots clinking on the obsidian-like rock. The climb was harder than she anticipated. The mountain's surface, though smooth, was deceptively sharp, with edges that seemed to shift underfoot. Hours into their ascent, the team began noticing odd formations. Crystalline spires jutted from the rock, with patterns that appeared almost organic, growths that twisted and curled like fossilized tendrils. Touching one sent a numbing cold through Emma's gloves. She pulled her hand back quickly, the sensation lingering like a faint hum beneath her skin. "Doc, you seeing this?" called Tom, one of the lead climbers, gesturing to a peculiar formation up ahead. She approached it, her breath hitching as she took in the sight. The structure was a doorway, or rather an archway, tall and narrow, framing the path ahead. It was carved into the mountain itself, with symbols etched around it, symbols she couldn't recognize but which stirred something ancient and fearful within her. Emma felt as though they were not just climbing the mountain but entering it, passing through an invisible threshold into its heart. "Do you think this is man-made?" Tom asked, running his fingers along the intricate carvings. Emma hesitated. I'm not sure, but this seems more deliberate than anything natural. Let's proceed with caution." As they moved through the arch, the light seemed to dim, as though the mountain devoured it, leaving only muted greys and shadows. The path beyond was a labyrinthine network of tunnels, some as tight as a clenched fist, others large enough to swallow buildings. The walls pulsated with veins of an eerie bioluminescent material, casting a sickly green glow that barely illuminated the way. Emma couldn't shake the sensation that they were traveling through something alive, something ancient and hostile. Hours passed as they navigated the winding tunnels, their voices hushed, footsteps echoing into an endless dark. The air grew colder, sharper, slicing into their lungs with each breath. And then they found the first body. It was half embedded in the wall, as if the mountain itself had swallowed it. The figure was skeletal, human-like, but with elongated limbs and hollow eye sockets, its face twisted in a silent scream. Emma felt her stomach churn. There was no record of any previous expedition, no account of others venturing here. And yet, this figure lay here, trapped in the mountain's cold embrace. What is this?" One of the younger crew members, Isaac, whispered, his voice trembling. Emma shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to stay together. Mark our path carefully." The deeper they ventured, the more bodies they found. Some were twisted into horrific shapes, their bones bent at impossible angles, fused into the walls, floors, even the ceilings. Each face was locked in agony, a chilling testament to whatever horror had consumed them. Emma's scientific curiosity began to unravel, fraying under the weight of something primal: fear. Eventually, they reached a vast chamber that seemed to breathe. The walls flexed, expanding and contracting as if the mountain itself was alive, a sleeping giant roused by their presence. In the center lay an altar, an unnaturally smooth slab of stone, slick with a dark, viscous fluid. Emma approached it reluctantly, her pulse pounding as she noticed something inscribed upon its surface. The symbols were familiar, similar to those on the archway, but she could make out their meaning now, as if the mountain itself whispered them to her mind. The bound one shall rise, the blood shall awaken. As she traced the words, a sudden tremor ran through the chamber. The walls shuddered, and a deep, rhythmic sound echoed through the stone. A heartbeat, steady and slow, reverberated around them, drowning out all thought. "What's happening?" Tom shouted, but his voice was drowned in the growing intensity of the pulsing. The liquid on the altar began to boil, releasing a foul, metallic scent. Emma stumbled back, horror flooding her as something began to form within the bubbling fluid. Something amorphous, shifting, reaching out with tendrils that dripped with the same viscous substance. It writhed, expanding, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, yet its features were indistinct, as if it were an unfinished memory. A scream erupted from Isaac as one of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his leg and pulling him toward the altar. Emma rushed forward, but another tendril blocked her, grazing her arm and leaving a searing cold in its wake. She watched, helpless, as Isaac was pulled into the dark fluid, his screams muffled as it consumed him. "Run!" Emma yelled, turning back toward the tunnels, her heart pounding as she urged the others forward. They stumbled through the dark, the mountain seemingly shifting around them, twisting passages they had once traversed into alien shapes. The heartbeat grew louder, faster, as if in pursuit, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating them with a pressure that threatened to crush their bones. One by one, her team fell, swallowed by the dark. Only Emma remained, racing down a corridor that seemed endless, her vision blurring as exhaustion set in. Just as her strength began to falter, a glimmer of daylight appeared ahead. She stumbled toward it, feeling the mountain's cold breath on her back as she dove into the open air. Emma collapsed onto the shore, gasping, her limbs numb, her mind fractured. She looked back at the mountain, which now seemed tranquil and silent under the daylight. No sign remained of her team, or the horrors she had witnessed. Rescue came days later. She was found delirious, babbling incoherently about a living mountain, about symbols and tendrils, about a heartbeat that hunted them. But no one believed her. The expedition was deemed a failure, and her warnings dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations.
Yet, as Emma recovered, she could still feel the cold in her bones, a chilling reminder that something waited within the forgotten peak. It had watched her leave, she was certain of that. And one day, she feared, it would call her back.
The playroom promised. They hadn't seen each other in 20 years, yet when they stepped onto the cracked asphalt of the old studio lot, the years peeled away like paint from the rotting walls. Callie, Trevor, Danny and Ben had been part of the playroom, a wildly popular children's show that seemed to vanish without explanation at the height of its fame. They had all left the show as kids, but none of them remembered why, or even how. They just knew that one day they stopped showing up to film and the playroom went dark. Now adults, each with fractured memories of the show, they had come back after receiving identical, ominous invitations. The letters, typed in the same vibrant, bubbly font of the playroom's logo, were signed only by Mr. Grin, just like old times. Their laughter echoed nervously as they reached the entrance, and Ben pulled open the door. A stale, suffocating smell rushed out like an exhale, thick with dust and the sour hint of mildew. The faded murals lining the walls greeted them, cartoonish faces grinning far too wide, eyes painted with swirling spirals. Those smiles. They had once been endearing, comforting even. But now they felt wrong, distorted. Callie walked ahead, her fingers brushing against one of the murals, memories hovering just out of reach. "Do you guys remember that song?" she whispered. "The one we'd sing every time we promised to play." Danny bit her lip. "Something about forever? And always being friends?" Trevor nodded, a chill in his eyes. "Forever, and never leave." The words tasted metallic as he spoke, dredging up fragments of memory. But the room was quiet, listening, as if waiting for something to complete the broken thought. The main set was just beyond a set of doors, which groaned as they opened. The brightly coloured playroom was faded and dust-caked, but intact. The once cheerful furniture lay scattered across the room like the remains of some chaotic event, oversized chairs and tables casting elongated, monstrous shadows in the flickering light from above. Ben knelt beside one of the chairs, his hand trembling as he traced the name etched crudely into the side. "Trevor's spot," he read aloud. "We each had one, remember?" His words hung heavy in the air, summoning fragmented memories. They'd had chairs, yes, and cups and plates labelled with their names. But the memories felt muddy, warped. A strange rhythmic thumping sounded from behind them, and they turned as one, their movements jerky and synchronized, like marionettes. A screen on the far wall blinked to life, bathing them in cold blue light. A familiar theme song played, but it was warped, dissonant, the tune slipping off key. And then there it was, the playroom. The show was starting, and the camera zoomed in on a version of themselves, younger, brighter, locked in the smiles they wore for the cameras. "Today," their child selves chimed in unison, "we're going to play hide and never seek." The adult Callie gasped, memories bursting forth like shrapnel. She remembered that game. It was a game they'd played frequently on set, and it had seemed innocent enough back then, just a game of hide and seek, or so they'd thought. But she remembered now the rules had always felt off. They'd been told to hide and not come out no matter what, until Mr. Grin found them. On the screen, the camera cut to an empty corridor in the studio, shrouded in shadow. "It's time for the playroom promise," their young voices sang, their harmony eerily off-key, as if some other voice had joined in deep and whispering. "Do you promise, kids? Promise to never leave?" Mr. Grin's voice oozed through the speakers, rough as nails on a chalkboard. A black figure loomed behind them on the screen, a faceless puppet with long, gloved fingers and a mouth stitched into a terrible grin. Trevor's breath hitched. "That's... I remember Mr. Grin. He'd tell us he was our special friend, the one we'd always play with, forever." But the longer they watched, the clearer it became that Mr. Grin had never been a friendly figure. His arms were too long, his face too blank, his head tilted ever so slightly toward each child, as though studying them. On the screen, the younger version of Ben whimpered, and Mr. Grin bent over him, whispering words only he could hear. Adult Ben backed away, trembling. "I remember him telling me I'd have to stay forever, even if I didn't want to." Suddenly, the screen cut to static, then flickered back to show their child selves running through the corridors. But the lighting was strange, surreal. The kids were laughing, but their eyes glistened with fear, darting back and forth as if sensing something lurking just off-screen. And then, one by one, the children began disappearing into shadows, until only little Callie remained. She was hiding in the main playroom, whispering the playroom promise to herself, a fragile mantra of self-protection. The camera zoomed in on her face, and she stopped chanting, her eyes flicking up to stare directly into the screen, into the eyes of her adult self. "You never kept the promise," she said, voice breaking. "You left us here." The lights in the room flickered violently, and with each blink, the shadows on the wall seemed to shift, grow. Long fingers curled around the edges of the doors and walls, creeping closer, like Mr. Grin was still watching. Callie staggered back. We left, but I don't remember leaving." Her voice trembled as she felt a strange, heavy presence settle around them, thick and cloying. Trevor looked at the old set, eyes wide with dread. "Maybe we never really did." The realization settled in their bones, a primal chill. The playroom had been more than a set, more than a show. It had been a place where they'd made a promise, one they had broken. A faint whisper echoed around them, like the sing-song chanting of their younger selves, inviting them to play. Their footsteps echoed as they moved, as if in a daze, to their respective spots, each of them feeling an invisible tug pulling them down into their old chairs. As they sat, the screen flickered once more, showing their child selves huddling in the dark, their faces frozen in a twisted, fearful smile. Callie's voice from the screen cracked, pleading, "It's your turn. It's your turn to hide. And never, ever leave." The walls seemed to close in around them, and the colours bled away, draining into shades of grey as the studio grew colder. The laughter of children echoed from all directions, yet no other soul was present. Only shadows lingered, watching, waiting. Then the lights went out, plunging them into pitch black. In the silence, they heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing closer, accompanied by the faintest whisper. "Forever, and never leave." The words echoed as the darkness thickened, pressing in on them, and in that moment, they understood. They were home. They had always been here. And this time, the playroom wasn't letting them go.
The Becoming. When the virus first hit, no one knew why it only affected women. It slipped quietly through the world like a sliver of glass under skin, slow and subtle, unnoticed until the pain could no longer be ignored. It was called the Marian virus, its name ironic, almost mocking, an infection associated with purity that stripped women of everything that made them human. I remember the day it came for me. I was washing dishes, watching the water run over my fingers. My hands had been aching for days, a dull, deep ache that made the bones feel like they were growing beyond my skin. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion. I hadn't been sleeping, haunted by dreams of strange, writhing creatures and visions of darkness thick as tar. But as I stood at the sink, I felt something under my skin shift, a subtle prickling like insects crawling just below the surface. It was there in my fingertips, a pressure pushing outward. I couldn't shake the feeling that my body was no longer my own. The virus worked fast, and it didn't take long for the symptoms to worsen. My skin became pale, almost translucent, veins tracing blue paths beneath the surface like rivers on a map. I wore gloves and long sleeves to hide the change from my family, who were already on edge, worried that I might be infected. My voice grew quieter, hollow, as if each word had to fight its way through a thick, suffocating fog. And then came the hunger, a gnawing need that started low in my belly and spread through my limbs. It was a hunger I couldn't satisfy, no matter how much I ate. A week into the symptoms, I started to avoid my reflection. My eyes had taken on a strange, dark sheen, the pupils stretching out into slits. It was as if something was peering back at me from beneath the surface, something ancient and patient waiting to be let free. My face began to change in small, unsettling ways. My cheekbones sharpened, my skin tight across my bones, giving me a skeletal look. My teeth ached, the pain radiating through my gums as if they were preparing to give way to something sharper. My husband David noticed the changes too, though he didn't dare to say anything at first. He would glance at me with a mixture of fear and pity, his gaze lingering on the places where my skin was beginning to crack, where patches of darker, almost scale-like skin had started to appear. But it was my daughter Mia who finally broke the silence. "Mommy, you're different," she whispered one night as I tucked her into bed. Her tiny fingers reached up to touch my face, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "You don't feel like you anymore." Her words lingered, burrowing into the part of me that still clung to what I had been. I wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that I was still her mother, but the lie stuck in my throat. Deep down, I knew that I wasn't the same. I could feel it in every cell, a foreign presence coiling within me, remaking me. Days blurred into nights as the transformation progressed. My senses sharpened, becoming animalistic. I could hear heartbeats through walls, smell the faintest hint of blood in the air. The world around me grew distant, cold, a web of sights and sounds that felt strange and hostile. And the hunger, it was no longer just a dull ache, but a ravenous, unyielding craving. I dreamed of tearing flesh, of hot metallic blood flooding my mouth. The dreams felt real, too real, and I would wake up with my teeth bared, hands curled into claws. One night, driven by a hunger I couldn't control, I found myself standing over Mia's bed. She was sleeping soundly, her small, warm body a temptation that sent waves of nausea and longing crashing through me. My hands trembled, the monstrous part of me warring with what remained of my humanity. The hunger was overwhelming, so consuming that I had to press my hands over my mouth to stifle the urge to bite down, to sink my teeth into her soft, unmarked skin. I stumbled back, barely able to contain the thing that had taken residence within me. I left that night, knowing I couldn't stay, knowing that whatever I had become was a threat to my family. I walked into the city, my steps heavy, my mind clouded by hunger and despair. The streets were empty, deserted as if the world itself was hiding from the horrors it had unleashed. And yet, I was not alone. Others like me drifted through the night, drawn by some primal instinct that bound us together. They moved with a strange, haunting grace, their eyes reflecting the same inhuman hunger I felt. Their skin was marked with the same dark patches, the same cracks through which the monstrous pulsed like a heartbeat. I could hear them whispering, a language that was not a language, sounds that scraped against my mind like broken glass. They understood me in a way no human could. We were sisters in this twisted rebirth, creatures of hunger and change. In the weeks that followed, we hunted together. I no longer thought of myself as human, no longer felt the guilt or horror that had once haunted me. The hunger was my guide, a relentless need that drove me forward. I had shed the last remnants of my former life, letting them slip away like skin peeled back from flesh. I was no longer bound by human rules, by morality or restraint. I was free, unchained, a creature of the dark. The world responded with fear, but fear was only fuel to us. Men built barricades, organized hunting parties, but they could not contain us. We were stronger, faster, driven by a purpose they could never understand. For every one of us that fell, 2 more rose, their bodies reshaped by the virus, their minds freed from the constraints of humanity. They called us monsters, but I knew the truth. We were the next stage, a new form of life born from the bones of the old. Humanity was dying, and we were its heirs, a testament to the resilience of life, even if that life was twisted and strange. One night, as I looked out over the city, my hunger momentarily sated, I felt a strange pang of nostalgia, a fleeting memory of my daughter's face, her small, warm hands against my skin. The memory was dull, distant, like an old photograph left in the sun. But even as it faded, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a reminder of something lost, a ghost of the woman I had once been. But the ache was brief, quickly overtaken by the familiar, comforting gnaw of hunger. I turned my gaze back to the city, my senses alive, every heartbeat, every scent calling to me. The memory slipped away, and with it the last trace of my humanity. I was no longer a mother, a wife, or a daughter. I was something else, something ancient and powerful, a creature of flesh and hunger, the vanguard of a new world. And as I disappeared into the night, the city trembling beneath my feet, I felt no regret, no remorse, only the thrill of the hunt, the endless, unquenchable thirst that drove me forward.
In the end, I was free. The Leaves of Oblivion. Evelyn Rosethorn was known throughout the Starlit Empire as the foremost expert in tea leaves, her passion, her profession, her every breath steeped in the fragrant art. From the blue mist leaves of Epsilon 3 to the somber brews of Carthinium 9, Evelyn's knowledge was unparalleled. But her expertise was of little comfort as she crept through the metallic halls of the Venkai, a ship controlled by the alien sovereignty. Her heart pounded, not for the exotic teas she'd encountered in the Empire's opulent gatherings, but for her sibling, Alistair, held somewhere deep within this vessel's labyrinthine hull. The sovereignty was more than an empire. It was a force, expansive, all-consuming, woven into the fabric of the galaxy like a relentless vine choking out lesser life. For Evelyn, her reputation had granted her access to this world, yet her mission here was personal. Alistair had been taken as leverage, a price for Evelyn's compliance to share her trade secrets. They wanted her to enrich their own culinary monopoly, but she knew better. They wanted to drain her, and when she was of no more use, discard her as they had countless others. Alistair was brilliant, a chemist who specialized in molecular compounds for their homeworld's defense forces. The sovereignty had stolen him from his laboratory under the guise of a research exchange, but Evelyn knew their true intentions. Alistair's knowledge was key to unlocking molecular warfare of terrifying precision. His capture was more than a bargaining chip. He was their blueprint for domination. Now, Evelyn's calm, practiced demeanor, honed over years of tea ceremonies, became her mask of defiance as she prowled through the ship's labyrinthine corridors. She had an ally on the inside, Master Kurov, a tea sommelier for the sovereignty's royal court. Kurov had extended a rare invitation for Evelyn to visit the imperial capital for a prestigious tea ceremony, an honor in itself. But that honor came with an unspoken price, a subtle threat, cloaked in the language of artistry and respect, warning Evelyn that her expertise could be used against her unless she complied with their demands. She had only one chance to get Alistair back, and it depended on slipping past the sovereignty's vigilant gaze. Kurov had directed her to a seldom-used corridor that veered off from the kitchen quarters. Here, the scent of spices and simmering herbs mixed with the faint metallic tang of disinfectant. She clutched a vial of powdery green Arn tea leaves, each minuscule particle a razor-edged secret. The leaves of Arn were bitter and disorienting, beloved for their exotic effect, but deadly in concentration. This vial was her lifeline, her shield. If discovered, she could offer it to Kurov as a gift to the sovereignty, a rare, powerful tea blend of her own creation. Its properties were subtle. A controlled sip could elevate the senses, but a pinch too much could induce debilitating vertigo. A voice crackled through her hidden earpiece, one of Kurov's human contacts murmuring directions in hushed, clipped tones. Next corridor to your left. Security bypassed, but you've only got 3 minutes before the patrols loop back. Evelyn slipped into a narrow passage, her breath quickening as she passed into the dim, red-lit tunnels that hummed with the ship's ominous, pulsating energy. Just beyond, she could see the faint shimmer of the containment field, pulsing in the faint light. Alistair was somewhere in that prison. She could almost feel him, like a phantom reaching through space. Her grip on the vial tightened as she approached, her fingers brushing the smooth metal of her concealed weapon, a tasting spoon hollowed out to contain a small dose of the potent Arn tea. The door slid open with a sigh, revealing a stark cell where Alistair was bound to a chair, his face shadowed by bruises, his spirit deflated by exhaustion. His hands were clenched, his gaze unfocused until he caught sight of her. The relief in his eyes was sharp, a wound that cut through her resolve. She moved forward, unshaken in her demeanor, each step a practiced glide, rehearsed 1,000 times in tea ceremonies that required unwavering grace. "Alistair," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here." "Evelyn," he managed, his voice cracked, a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "You shouldn't have come. They'll—" "I don't care," she interrupted, her tone firm. She slid her hollow tasting spoon to his lips. "A little Arn tea," she whispered, the words rolling off her tongue as if discussing a fine brew. "This will numb the pain." He drank, wincing as the bitter powder touched his tongue. Almost immediately his body relaxed, his breathing steadied, and Evelyn saw the faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. But then came the clanging of footsteps, loud and purposeful. Evelyn moved swiftly, positioning herself between Alistair and the door, her body angled protectively. 2 sovereignty guards stepped into the room, their elongated forms casting sinister shadows in the red glow. Their segmented armor glistened like the carapaces of ancient beetles, their eyes expressionless as they surveyed her. "Rosethorn," the first guard intoned, "you're scheduled to present your findings to the court." His gaze flicked to Alistair, a look of mild distaste souring his alien features. "This is unorthodox." Evelyn held up her vial of Arn tea leaves, her fingers gracefully presenting it as though it were a gift. "For the court," she replied, her voice velvety, calm. "A sample of Arn, an infusion like none they've tasted, but it requires precise preparation." The guards exchanged glances, curious but wary. Her reputation as a master tea artisan was a potent weapon here. They couldn't resist a new delicacy. She held the vial up, watching as the alien's gaze followed it, entranced by the promise of rarity. It took only a second, one critical second in which they relaxed, allowing her to lean forward and release a delicate puff of Arn dust into the air. It was enough. They staggered, hands clamping onto their throats as the Arn tea's effect swept over them, inducing dizziness and confusion. Evelyn took advantage of their disorientation, slipping past them with Alistair in tow. They sprinted through the corridors, Evelyn navigating by memory as Alistair struggled to keep pace, weakened by captivity. The passageway opened onto a loading bay, where an escape pod gleamed under the dim lights. They clambered in, Evelyn quickly securing Alistair before sliding into the pilot's seat. She initiated the launch sequence, the hum of the pod's engines growing louder as they prepared to jettison from the Sovereignty's ship. Through the window, she could see the guards scrambling into the bay, their movements slow and fumbling under the lingering effects of the Arn dust. A wave of satisfaction washed over her as she activated the controls, sending them hurtling into the void, away from the Sovereignty's grasp. As the stars streaked past the pod's windows, Alistair's voice broke the silence. You risked everything," he whispered, his words trembling as he looked at her. His sister, the unassuming tea master turned reluctant spy. Evelyn allowed herself a faint smile, the taste of bitter Arn still lingering on her lips. "There are things worth risking everything for," she replied softly, her gaze steady. And though the vast empire still loomed in the darkness, she knew they had escaped, at least for now. For Evelyn Rosethorn, a leaf of oblivion had unfurled, carrying them away, if only for one fleeting precious moment.
The gravity of legacy. The hiss of static filled the cramped space elevator as it ascended, a soft but incessant intrusion into Nora's mind. She'd taken this elevator dozens of times between Earth's surface and the orbital station. But tonight, as she rose thousands of kilometers above the planet, there was something different. A faint voice tangled in the static, a whisper that seemed to cling to the walls and vibrate through her bones. Nora inhaled, trying to focus on her tablet. She had hours of work to review before her meeting with the board. With her recent promotion, she'd been granted access to files she hadn't seen before, records, memos, and, disturbingly, archived memories of their late CEO, Evelyn Cross. Cross had been dead for over a decade, but her personality fragment, extracted and preserved, remained in the company archives. Legally, it was a controversial practice, but Cross's vision had been deemed too valuable to lose. Now it seemed that vision was clawing its way back into the company's affairs. As Nora read, the tablet glitched, freezing for a moment before jumping back to an earlier page. She frowned and swiped forward, but the words had changed. She blinked, feeling a chill as she read them again. "Did you think I'd let them erase me?" The words were not hers. They weren't from any company document she'd ever read. She ran her finger across the screen, but they remained, unchanging and faintly ominous. The elevator shuddered as it continued its ascent, and the lights overhead flickered. "Yeah, nothing to worry about," she murmured, her voice sounding too loud in the confined space. But then, in the dim light, she saw her own reflection on the glossy tablet screen, only it wasn't her face staring back. The eyes were cold, the skin tight and shadowed, the mouth set in a calculating smirk. Evelyn Cross's image, unmistakable and unyielding, was staring right at her. Nora's breath caught and she nearly dropped the tablet. She pressed the power button, desperate to clear the screen, but it wouldn't shut off. The face continued to glare at her, the static in her ears growing louder until it felt as though the entire elevator was humming with the sound. "You're not ready for what I built," the image said, its mouth moving slowly, words forming in a voice that was not hers, but filled with contempt. "Evelyn," Nora whispered, unsure if she was speaking to herself or the apparition on her screen. "The board thought they could bury me, bury what I knew, but they needed me more than they ever admitted." The words vibrated through the metal frame, and for a moment, Nora swore the walls of the elevator pulsed. She stumbled backward, pressing herself against the cold steel as the voice continued. "The company has become soft, predictable. They're blind to the future because they fear it." With a jolt, the elevator slowed, the console's lights flickering erratically. A red warning light flashed across the control panel. But before Nora could check the display, her tablet screen blinked off, casting her into near darkness. Her own panicked reflection stared back at her in the glass window, but she wasn't alone. Standing just behind her in the dimness of the cabin was Evelyn's figure, a skeletal, translucent form, her eyes shining with a harsh, unforgiving light. Her outline buzzed as if barely clinging to reality, her body a spectre assembled from static. Nora's heart pounded, her body frozen in terror. "What do you want?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "To reclaim what was mine." The figure's lips barely moved, but the words echoed in Nora's head, carrying a conviction that was almost physical. You're just a memory fragment," Nora stammered, trying to summon the confidence she had felt moments before. "You're not real." "The memory of me is more real than the hollow existence you live," Evelyn sneered. "My legacy was never meant to be passed on to the weak." The elevator jolted again, its lights flickering erratically. She tried to steady herself as the floor seemed to vibrate beneath her, each shudder sending her heart racing. The emergency console displayed a flashing error message. "Personnel conflict detected." Words that made no sense but carried a dread weight in their simplicity. "Evelyn, you're gone. You can't run the company from the grave," Nora said, her voice shaky but firm. "So, I built everything you see. You think I'd let a child like you take it away?" Evelyn's apparition grew darker, her features sharpening into a cruel mockery of life. "I designed this structure, this company, for survival, and now it's in danger because of weak hands." The elevator began to shake violently, and Nora reached for the emergency stop, but her fingers went numb. The console glowed with an eerie light as Evelyn's face flickered across it, her mouth set in an unyielding line. The overhead lights went dark, leaving only the faint glow of Evelyn's face, half hidden in shadow. "I did what I had to," the voice said, softer now, almost regretful. "But they erased the parts of me that were too driven, too ruthless. They thought they could purify my vision, dilute it, but I remain." The elevator shuddered and jolted, throwing Nora off balance. She stumbled, her hand slamming against the control panel, but nothing responded. The cabin temperature dropped suddenly, her breath fogging in front of her as Evelyn's voice filled the space, a dissonant symphony of malice and conviction. "Tell the board, tell them I'm still here, my vision lives on." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, a dangerous light glinting within them. "If they won't listen, I'll remind them what true power looks like." With that, the static grew louder and the lights flared, blinding Nora. She threw her hands up, but the light burned through her closed eyes, filling her head with a terrible, searing clarity. Images rushed through her mind, blueprints of the elevator, designs for weapons she couldn't comprehend, faces of people she didn't know, each one twisted by fear, each one staring into Evelyn's eyes. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The elevator's lights returned to normal, the hum of the machinery steady and soft. Nora found herself slumped against the wall, her heart racing, her palms sweaty and cold. The screen on her tablet was blank, the console reading normal operation. She looked around, half expecting to see Evelyn's ghostly figure lingering nearby, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, the distant hum of machinery, and the slowly blinking lights. When the elevator doors finally opened onto the orbital station, Nora stumbled out, breathing in the recycled air with a mix of relief and disbelief. She leaned against the wall, her legs trembling, her mind racing. Her tablet buzzed. She looked down, her heart pounding as she saw a new message flash across the screen. A simple message, but one that sent a chill down her spine. "I'll be waiting at the next board meeting." She tried to delete the message, but it refused to disappear. She could almost hear Evelyn's voice in her head, cold and ruthless, a presence that seemed to have embedded itself within her very thoughts. The final circuit. The crowd roared with a feral hunger, the sound clawing up the walls of the grim arena and echoing off the thick glass that kept them safe from the mayhem below. Above it all, the announcer's voice, polished and sickly sweet, sliced through the cacophony. "Ladies and gentlemen, another glorious day in the circuit!" Cheers thundered back. Thousands of people packed into the crumbling stadium, faces painted and hoarse from chanting the names of their favourite prisoners. Down in the pit, Cade wiped his cracked lips and tightened his grip on the jagged pipe he'd salvaged from a rusted fence. His opponent, a man known only as Breaker, flexed his fingers around a twisted piece of rebar, his gaze cold and lethal. Cade didn't flinch, but he felt the same chill that crawled over him every time the gates opened, and he entered the circuit. Breaker was known for ending fights quickly. One strike and his opponent would be a heap of broken bones, the audience left howling for more. Cade wasn't sure how many rounds Breaker had survived, but he knew enough to understand that Breaker had carved his reputation on the backs of other prisoners, bodies piled high behind him like a twisted resume. "Remember the deal," whispered Shade, Cade's pit partner, from behind. Shade had a busted knee and a permanent bruise under one eye, but still somehow retained a fire in her stare that kept her alive. "Take him to the wire, get close enough and he'll make a mistake, they all do." Cade nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His heart hammered, but he pushed the fear down. There was no room for hesitation here. The circuit didn't tolerate it. "Begin!" The word came as a gunshot in the heavy air, and both men sprang forward, weapons raised. Cade darted left, feinting, his body moving in time with the frantic beat of his heart. He dodged as Breaker swung the rebar in a brutal arc, the wind whistling with the force of the blow. Cade slipped underneath, his jagged pipe scraping Breaker's ribs, drawing blood. The crowd's roar reached fever pitch. Breaker grinned, teeth bloody, and thrust his rebar forward. Cade barely dodged, the metal scraping across his shoulder, leaving a long, shallow cut. He stumbled but didn't fall. Not yet. "You got spirit," Breaker sneered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Guts too. They'll look good on the ground." Cade stayed silent, focusing on his breathing, steadying himself. He'd learned not to answer his opponents. Words were for the spectators, and he wouldn't waste his breath for them. In the stands, screens flashed with updated odds, numbers flickering like neon death notices. Cade's face appeared briefly, the footage capturing every bead of sweat, every twitch of determination. The numbers didn't matter to him, but to the people in the stands, he was a commodity, a gamble, a pulse-pounding spectacle. They didn't know the truth. The circuit was designed to keep prisoners fighting, not to give them a chance at freedom. No one ever left. The winners got one final round, another impossible fight. It was a lie that dangled hope in front of the desperate, convincing them they could earn something more than a quick death. Cade knew this, but he also knew that fighting was all he had left. Each swing, each dodge, was a rebellion, a refusal to be broken entirely by the system that had placed him here. Breaker lunged again, his strikes becoming wild as he grew impatient. Shade had been right. Breaker's confidence was his weakness. Cade waited, feeling the weight of his weapon, timing each move. He baited Breaker closer, letting him think he had the advantage, until he could see the glint of arrogance in his opponent's eyes. And then he struck. In one swift motion, Cade brought the jagged pipe down on Breaker's wrist, feeling the snap of bone beneath. Breaker howled, dropping the rebar, but before he could react, Cade was on him, slamming the pipe into his side again and again, each blow fueled by weeks of hatred, fear, and exhaustion. The crowd went silent for a moment, then erupted in manic cheers. Blood splattered the dirt as Cade stumbled back, panting, his hands slick and shaking. Breaker lay still, the life gone from his eyes, another nameless casualty of the circuit. "Victor, Cade Marlowe," the announcer declared, his voice dripping with showmanship. Cade felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the truth. He was now part of the spectacle, another monster for the crowd to idolize and eventually discard. "Come on, Cade," Shade urged, helping him toward the gate. She moved with a limp, her arm around his shoulders for balance. "They'll send you back soon. You've got a little time to breathe." They trudged through the dank, dark corridors beneath the arena, passing other fighters waiting for their turn in the circuit. Faces looked up, eyes filled with anger, envy, and even pity. They all knew what was coming. "Shade," he began, voice raw. "How long do you think we can keep doing this?" She didn't answer right away, but he saw the look in her eyes, the resignation mixed with a flicker of defiance. "As long as we have to," she replied softly, "or until we find a way out." In the cramped cell they shared, they could still hear the faint murmur of the crowd, a distant reminder of the world that existed just beyond the walls. Cade leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his bloodied hands. Freedom was a myth, an illusion dangled before them to keep them docile. But tonight, as he lay in the darkness, an idea began to form, growing stronger with each beat of his heart. He wasn't just a piece in their game. He was still a man, a fighter. And the crowd, the cameras, the guards, they were vulnerable. The circuit wasn't a fortress. It was a machine, built by people, controlled by people. "Shade," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What if we stopped playing?" She looked at him, a shadow of fear crossing her face. "You mean—" "No more fights," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Not unless it's on our terms. We take control. We don't let them use us to entertain themselves." For the first time in months, he saw a spark of hope in Shade's eyes. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it was something real, something beyond survival. "Then we'll need allies," she said, a faint smile forming. "Other fighters, ones who still remember what it's like to want more than just another day." Cade nodded, feeling a surge of purpose he hadn't felt in years. They would build something in the heart of the circuit, a rebellion, a reminder that they were still human. The odds were against them, the walls were thick and the guards were armed, but Cade felt something new stirring within him. The next day, as he entered the arena again, the crowd's cheers felt different, weaker, as if he could already hear the crack forming in their foundation. They wanted blood, but he would give them something else, something they couldn't contain or control. When the fight began, he looked up at the crowd, at the cameras, and raised his pipe high, a silent promise.
The last drift. The constellation drifted in the hollow silence of deep space, a lonely vessel holding what was left of humanity's dreams. Its crew, scientists, engineers, survivors of Earth's collapse, had been tasked with a singular, desperate mission: reach Theta 9, a distant world rumored to be habitable. Their journey was humanity's last gasp, a thread of hope in the dark sea of a ruined cosmos. Commander Era Lennox stood at the observation deck, hands clasped tightly behind her back, her reflection barely visible in the faint glow of the consoles. Stars winked at her from the infinite, indifferent to their plight. She had spent years training for this voyage, but nothing could prepare her for the weight of being one of humanity's last guardians. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Era turned to see Dr. Arden West, the mission's lead biologist, entering the room with an uneasy expression. "We're getting anomalies in the biosystems," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rapid degradation of the oxygen reserves, though there's no breach or malfunction in the life support systems." Era's stomach tightened. Oxygen failures were supposed to be impossible. Every system on the constellation was designed with fail-safes and redundancies. "Could it be a sensor issue?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought so at first," Arden replied, shaking his head, "but we ran diagnostics 3 times. It's not a glitch, Commander. Something is draining it, almost like it's being consumed." Era stared at him, the words settling like stones. "Do you mean biological contamination?" Arden hesitated, his gaze darting to the corners of the room as if something might be lurking there. "That's just it. There's no trace of foreign bacteria or known pathogens in the samples we've tested, but the oxygen depletion is accelerating, as if it's deliberate." Era's pulse quickened. On a ship sealed tighter than any vault, such a threat seemed impossible. And yet, Constellation had encountered nothing but darkness since departing the last safe station. What could have possibly entered the ship? She nodded, taking a breath to steady herself. "Let's keep this between us for now. I'll inform the rest of the senior crew once we have more information. In the meantime, double the oxygen rations and restrict unnecessary movement." Arden nodded, but his face betrayed his unease. "Understood, Commander. I'll keep you updated." Hours later, the constellation was plunged into artificial night, lights dimmed as the crew attempted to conserve energy. Era lay on her cot in her quarters, staring at the metal ceiling, thoughts churning. Drained oxygen, a ship floating in silence. Each piece gnawed at her, drawing her mind to terrifying possibilities she didn't want to consider. A knock interrupted her restless thoughts. She opened the door to see Finn Delaunay, the ship's chief engineer, standing outside, looking grim. He held up a handheld device with the ship's internal schematics glowing faintly. "Commander, we've got another problem," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "The propulsion systems are lagging, anomalies cropping up all over. I've never seen readings like these. It's like something's weighing us down, holding the ship back." Era frowned, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. "Holding us back? Like, from the outside?" Finn nodded, his expression shadowed. "But here's the thing, Era. Our sensors aren't picking up anything external. I did a full scan. Nothing in the vicinity, no gravitational sources or foreign objects. It's as if whatever's affecting us is inside, moving along with us." Inside. The word sent a chill through her. She glanced around the corridor, imagining unseen forces slithering through the walls, hidden by the cold metal shielding of the constellation. "We need answers," she said, her voice steel. "Run a sweep of the entire ship, check every conduit, every duct. If there's something here with us, I want to know." Finn nodded, though the hesitation in his eyes was unmistakable. "Understood, Commander, but if this isn't mechanical, what are we dealing with?" Era didn't answer. She didn't know. But as she watched Finn disappear into the dim hallway, a new thought formed, half buried under her racing heartbeat. What if this was a trap? A calculated, sentient act? The hours stretched into a tense silence, broken only by sporadic reports from the crew. Systems continued to degrade, oxygen reserves dwindling faster than they could manage. Several crew members reported hearing strange noises, scraping sounds in the air ducts, faint whispers vibrating through the walls. The ship had become a coffin of thin metal, each creak and groan amplifying the growing fear. It was Dr. Arden who approached her again, his face pale and drawn. "Commander," he said, his voice trembling, We might be under attack." Era braced herself. "Explain." He held up a small vial, the liquid inside swirling with a faint, eerie phosphorescence. We found traces of an unknown substance on Deck 7. It's reactive, almost alive. Her stomach dropped. Alive? Like a virus? Not exactly. It seems sentient, responding to stimuli in ways we've never seen. It reacts to heat, light, even the vibrations of our voices. I believe it's an organism, one that's capable of consuming oxygen, manipulating our systems, maybe even communicating through the ship itself. A strange numbness washed over her. A sentient organism embedded in their vessel, feeding on them, watching them. She turned, her eyes scanning the dim control room as if it might reveal some hidden watcher. "We need to isolate it," she said. "Evacuate Deck 7, seal it off completely." But Arden shook his head, the vial clutched tight in his hand. "It's already spreading, Era. By the time we found it, it had moved through the ventilation shafts and wiring. Sealing one deck won't stop it." Era felt her breath hitch, fear coiling around her thoughts. "Then we have to destroy it. If it's on Deck 7, we'll sever the conduits and purge the systems manually." "Era," Arden whispered, his eyes wide. "What if it's intelligent? What if it's aware of us?" She stopped, meeting his gaze. It was the last thought she wanted to entertain, but as she stared at the glowing vial, an idea, both horrific and undeniable, took root. If this thing had come aboard silently, already in control, then perhaps it had been lying in wait. Had they been destined to be the organism's next hosts, another forgotten crew drifting in space? A distant thud echoed through the ship, a sound like bones snapping under pressure. The lights flickered, dimming to near darkness. The temperature dropped, and a low hum vibrated through the walls. "It's here," Arden whispered, his voice hollow. The remaining lights blinked off, casting them into absolute darkness. Ira's voice cut through the silence, raw and desperate. "All hands to emergency positions. Prepare for lockdown." But before the call could even register, the hum transformed into a voice, reverberating through the ship's speakers in a distorted metallic tone. "We have traveled far," it said, words crawling like venom across her skin. "You are now part of us." A cold horror seized Era, as the weight of their isolation, their entrapment, became fully real. They weren't alone. They had never been alone. The constellation had become a host for something older, something beyond their understanding. And it was hungry. In the pitch darkness, with the crew's panic rising like a silent scream, Era felt the presence close in around her, unseen yet everywhere, its intentions as vast and empty as the stars.
Thank you for watching, and remember, the darkness awaits. Until our paths cross again, stay fearful and stay subscribed.